These color bars are provided as a reference for you to adjust your playback system, ensuring maximum picture quality. Please adjust your sets now. In tape number 2, we discussed the advantage of using BDE as an exposure reference. In this volume, metering and film sensitivity to light will be introduced. Faculty member Paul Meyer explains.
You know, most modern cameras have built-in exposure meters. Many of the automatic cameras will calculate all of the controls discussed in the previous tape. Those cameras will do a good job most of the time. However, there are situations where the photographer chooses to alter the meter-indicated exposure for a desired effect, or when the meter inappropriately calculated the exposure. In order to do this, you have to understand how the calculation process works. To best explain the process, let's look at what the meter is calibrated to do. The film can record a series of tones from white to black. Regardless of the brightness of the scene that's in front of the camera, this meter-indicated exposure will try to place the exposure near the middle of the film, and that works real well most of the time. Let's take a look at a few examples.
These images have an equal amount of dark and bright areas. The camera's light meter will read the scene as an average, which will be in the middle of the scale.
In the first example, there was a very small amount of bright or dark areas. Most of the tones fell into the middle area. In the second, however, there were no middle tones, okay, or very few middle tones. Most of the brightness levels were either bright or dark areas, which averaged into the middle of the film. In a scene whose brightness values are high, the meter does not understand that the scene should be predominantly bright and will try to place it in the middle. The same applies for a basically dark scene. The meter will try to compensate for the darkness. For this reason, we must understand that we can override the meter or make adjustments with one of the camera controls we have available to us.
These are two examples of photographs that might fool the camera's meter. The photographer must know what the meter is reading in any given scene.
We're in a shooting situation here where the sun has dropped below 20 degrees, and we no longer have a basic daylight exposure. So we can't use that as our exposure. We know it's a reference, and we're less than BDE, so we know we're going to have to do something here. We've got a lot of water. We've got the harbor seals on the beach among the rocks. We can't use the water as our exposure reference because it's reflecting a very bright sky. We can't use the rocks where the seals are, and that's our subject area. We can't use that because they're being backlit, basically, and there's a lot of shadow on them. And they're quite dark animals. So we can't use that as our exposure reference either, or it's not going to look natural. So what I'm going to do is when the water recedes, I'm going to meter an area of the beach that is drying up a little bit as the water goes out. And I'll use that as my basic exposure. Then I can take photographs out in the water when the harbor seals move out. That'll be properly exposed. And also when they come back in among the rocks, I'll use the same exposure. And they'll be properly exposed there. So no matter where they move, we've got one exposure to handle all those situations.
We've been watching Ralph use his knowledge of how the meter-indicated exposure tries to fit the scene into this middle value, 18% gray. The scene was changing and he found something in the middle to point his meter at to give him the appropriate exposure. The one thing we haven't talked about is the fact that many cameras on the market are designed for photographers who understand this concept. Some cameras are marked with a +1, +2 on their meters. If you think of this middle value as being 0, and a white with detail being a +2 value, what that means is the +2 is 2 stops away from middle gray. So a scene with a lone skier on a white snow-capped mountain would require that you use the +2 setting on your camera. This, in effect, is increasing your exposure from a normal reading by 2 stops. Likewise, a scene that was predominantly black with detail would be considered a -2. You could set your meter on -2 or decrease your exposure by 2 stops by using a smaller aperture or a faster shutter speed. There are also brightness values in between the middle gray, such as a +1 and a -1, which are only 1 stop away from the middle point. In other words, from white with detail to black with detail, there are 4 stops in between the 5 values.
The plus and minus settings on this Nikon camera allow photographers the ability to control how his or her meter views a particular scene. Light meters are available in virtually all camera formats. Nikon offers matrix, center-weighted, and spot metering on many of their new models. Hasselblad has introduced a very accurate metering system on their medium format cameras called tonal contrast control. Sinar has a very sophisticated film plane metering probe which allows commercial photographers complete control in virtually any area of the large 4x5 film.
Remember that reflective light meters are designed to see every scene as middle gray. In order to obtain proper exposures based on your camera's light meter, you must understand this important fact. As Ralph illustrated, try finding something in every scene to use as a metering reference and base your exposure on that particular area. Also keep in mind that many of today's cameras offer the photographer the ability to override the meter-indicated exposure by a plus and minus system. By understanding the different tones or shades that film can record from white to black, you'll begin to comprehend how to use these controls to your advantage. Begin experimenting with film by varying or bracketing your exposures from normal to +1, +2, -1, and -2. Find out for yourself how the film reacts to these exposure variations.